YWCA Scotland.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this very early morning Zoom. We're very excited to kick things off. If you're new to YWCA Scotland, the Young Women's Movement, we are Scotland's national feminist organisation for young women leading change they want to see. And today we have a group of young women with us who will be presenting results of very important research, but I will let them do all the talking. And yeah, if you're new to the organization and you don't know what sort of work we do, I would recommend following us on social media. It's always at Young Women Scot. And I will also in the chat, I will put the link to the report. If you haven't looked at it yet, I would definitely recommend you having a really good look after this meeting, because it's extremely important and the findings are important for all industries and all sectors, but the speakers will introduce them in a moment. And now I will pass you on to Brianna Pegado, who is chair of YWCA Scotland and who is also chairing today's event. So a double chair, passing over to Brianna.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. We're looking forward to sharing this research and findings with you this morning. And as Patricia mentioned, you'll be hearing directly from the young women that have conducted this research. Before we get started this morning and I introduce our panel of researchers, I wanted to say a little bit more about Young Women Lead. So the Young Women Lead Committee is a leadership program for young women aged 30 and under who live in Scotland. It's delivered in partnership with the Scottish Parliament and YWCA Scotland, the Young Women's Movement. The programme was first launched in 2017 and was created from a need to address the lack of representation of young women in politics. So in the 2019-2020, the programme was revised with the intention to increase young BAME women's political participation and to hear their voices and experiences. So that is the year that this research obviously is coming out of. Currently, out of 1,421 elected officials in Scotland, there are only 422 women and only 4 from minority ethnic backgrounds, making up only 0.28%, or sorry, 0.28%. BAME women are underrepresented in all sectors of the labour market, and we want to change this to better reflect Scottish society. So that I just read to you is the introduction to the Young Women Lead 2019-2020 report. So again, please do read it, and we're sharing the link for you, and it's been shared in the chat. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our Young Women Lead graduate panel members. But before I do, we'd love to learn a little bit more about you and what's brought you to this event today. So very shortly, you'll see a poll pop up on your screen. We have a couple of questions for you. The first poll should be appearing shortly, and the first question should be there. So just to say, this poll is completely anonymous. We will not be sharing the results. The results are for our purposes only, to get a better sense of kind of your needs across the sector as employers and as employees within companies and organizations, and just to get a better sense of what your priorities and needs are. So take a moment to please answer the poll. They're all multiple choice and anonymous, and just press submit when you're finished. And then it will move on to our panel. I'm going to answer the questions myself. Right, so after you've filled out the polls, or you've answered yes or no, press submit, and we'll collect that data from you soon. So thanks everyone for participating in that poll, and feel free to take your time. I'm now going to introduce our Young Women Lead graduate panel members. So first, I will introduce Rabia Akhtar. Rabia studied law at the University of Edinburgh and graduated in 2016 before joining Standard Life in the Phoenix Group. She's currently a proposition manager focusing on the international bond market and has held varied roles within the organization prior to this. Rabia is the co-chair of the Mosaic Network, Phoenix Group's Black, Asian, and minority ethnic BAME colleague network. During her time as, co-chair, she's been instrumental in promoting the professional development of Phoenix's BAME communities and increasing the social and cultural awareness of the wider business. Next, we have Nikki Chung. Nikki is an MSc Gender Studies graduate. She currently works in the women's sector supporting women affected by domestic abuse and delivers training around violence against women. She's interested in equalities and human rights and hopes to eventually work in research and policy within this field. And our third panelist is Lauren Mawale, and she's a final year undergraduate at the University of Edinburgh, majoring in mathematics. Her work experience includes BlackRock, Grant Thornton, and Lazard, and she's interested in using behavioral economics to create sustainable business decisions. If you get a chance to speak to her, ask for a book recommendation. Lauren loves reading, traveling, and having inspiring conversations. And it's very, very clear and easy to say we have an inspiring group of young women who are all so impressive that will be sharing their findings today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand off to Rabia to tell us a bit more about the report and the process. So on to you.
Thank you, Brianna, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're all ecstatic to have recently launched our report, and although it's been a weird virtual year, we've really enjoyed pulling this together. So we're super excited to share with you all today sort of what our findings are and what we've learned through this report. So our chosen topic of inquiry this year is the transition from education to employment for young women. And we investigated what measures are being taken to increase employment opportunities for women from ethnic minorities, including recruitment, retention, and development policies and practices. This is a really important topic to us all as girls, and it was something we were so passionate about. I remember when we first got together to decide what our research topic would be, we all had so many stories to share on this topic and so many of our own experiences. I definitely had a lot of things to share within this topic, but when you heard everyone else in the room and their similar experiences, I think it really brought to life that actually this is really much still a problem, and this is just hearing everybody in the room, but imagine how many other people out there have got a story to share, or have got something to share about barriers whether they face between education and employment, or just something they feel could have really helped them on their journey. So the purpose of this inquiry for us was to discover what can be done to increase opportunities and employer accountability in relation to the employment, training and development of women from ethnic minorities. So what more can employers really do to help women in these roles to either progress or make sure that they're getting the most out of their working jobs. Another purpose was what can be done to share best practice between organizations. We will look further into sort of our findings, but one thing is definite that a lot of organizations are doing different things within this area. So what we want to understand is what can organizations do to learn from each other, what's working and what isn't working. So it's really important that organizations can share this knowledge with each other. And also what can be done to strengthen links between education services, employability support and employers. This one's massive because I think when you're in education, that's really the first time you hear about sort of the working life and about jobs and what's sort of next. And you see so many being women do so well in education and graduate from university and have got all these dreams to go on and sort of have a successful career. But then when you move on into sort of go into jobs, like for instance, I'm in the finance industry, you don't see that, you don't see those being women in these roles. Like I work in the finance industry and to be honest, there's hardly any females within senior organizations, and then there's no BAME females, and there aren't any role models there to look up to. So we want to look at understanding that gap why is it so many are so successful when it comes to education, but then where are they then down the employment line? Why are they not progressing, and what more needs to be done there? So we focused on 3 key areas as a committee. So the routes into employment, so including education and the third sector and how they support women from ethnic minorities. We looked at sort of the best practice examples to encourage recruitment, retention and development of minority ethnic young women. And then we also looked at sort of addressing racism and discrimination in the workplace. So what more needs to be done in the workplace, so including sort of unconscious bias, is sort of diversity celebrated in the workplace, what more needs to be done to raise cultural awareness. And we also looked at sort of policies for employers and within education in terms of sort of harassment policies, flexible working for employees, and sort of like their bullying policies as well, and what's done there in terms of supporting racism. So I think it's really important to mention, though, that a lot of previous work has been done by the Scottish Parliament committees around this topic, but despite a number of policy initiatives such as the Race Equality Action Plan, the Developing the Young Women Workforce, just a couple of examples, the outcomes for ethnic minority women haven't improved over the past 2 decades. We know what the issues are. You know, we're going to be talking a little bit about the issues today. You know, there's research done out there to say what the issues are, and more women are coming forward, but we need to see some action. We need to make change. We shouldn't be still having these conversations in a few years' time where we're repeating what the issues are. It's time to really see some action and change. And I think it's really time for the government to ensure that accountability for progress within organizations is really held, and for employers to really track progress and measure change, so that we can sort of see as we go on, is you know, the things that we're doing, is this having any difference? And if it isn't, what more can be done? But it's time for change, and it's time to see action. I'll pass on to Nikki, who will talk through sort of how we pulled this report together and the research we did.
Thanks for that, Rabia. Morning, everyone. So I'm just going to go into a wee bit about how we did conduct the research. So back in February, when pre-lockdown, when everything was still open, we were able to kind of go into Parliament. We kind of picked out key organisations and speakers that we'd invited to go into the Parliament and kind of give like a evidence session for us. So we invited 5 people, and that mainly was from the third sector and public sector. So we had someone coming in from Council of Ethnic Minority Voluntary Sector Organisation, someone from AMNA, the Muslim Women's Resource Centre, someone from Sikh Sanjog, Skills Development Scotland, and AAI Employability. But in a report, it kind of lists more detail around what was maybe said in the evidence session. But basically, it was just kind of gather a bit more information around what was maybe needed to kind of improve young BAME women's employment opportunities and like educational opportunities within Scotland. So that was like really interesting. And then from that, we kind of came together as a group, and then we kind of brainstormed ideas around how or what our next steps were going to be. That was mainly focused on what kind of surveys that we needed to kind of target our audience and gather that specific data that we needed to kind of produce this report. So after that, we kind of knuckled down into 2 main areas. So we had like an education team and an employment team, and within that we developed 4 surveys. So the first one was, and one of the main points as well actually is we really wanted to hear from women obviously that lived experience within Scotland, and because our group was our Young Women League cohort was within the age range of 16 to 30, we thought that was like ideal to kind of target that audience as well in gathering our data. So the first survey was for employers, and that was basically just reaching out to our own contacts, or just like kind of emailing, I guess, like general inquiries or any people that we could find in different sectors, so like private, public and third sector charities as well. And that was mainly just kind of asking what diversity and inclusion kind of meant to their organisation, how the organisation proactively sourced young BAME candidates, and what support their organisation would find helpful to increase a diverse workforce. The second survey within the employers group was around gathering data from BAME women ages 16 to 30, in employment. So we wanted to know a bit more about whether there were BAME women in leadership positions, and what their organisation did to kind of support their career development. And then also just kind of finding a bit more about how comfortable they felt about reporting racial harassment as well. And then part of the education group, they had 2 surveys as well. So the first one was aimed at teachers, in particular like guidance teachers, who kind of provided careers advice, I guess, to support young BAME women. How often the services were used and what kind of career paths BAME women selected. And then the final education survey was targeted at young BAME women, again within the ages of 16 to 30, with lived experience in the education system in Scotland. So we were interested in learning more about the transition from education to employment for BAME women. We kind of asked what resources were available to gain employment, and if there were equal opportunities in accessing help and information on career choices. So a lot of surveys that we had to kind of distribute, but luckily we were able to get quite a lot actually of responses. So in terms of like the employer survey, we managed to get 22. Would have ideally liked more than that, but I don't know if it was just given the whole like lockdown situation, like people were quite stretched and like stressed as well about how to maybe adapt to the situation. So that might have been like a caveat. We managed to get 102 responses from the employees, young BAME women in Scotland. Managed to get 25 survey responses from teachers and 96 responses from the education survey. So from this, we were able to, after all the surveys closed, we were able to kind of gather that data and kind of get like a brief overview on maybe what we needed to explore a bit more. So we held some focus groups and interviewed employers as well, just to kind of find more about their survey responses, I guess. And to do this as well, we had to use YWCA's social media just to kind of reach out to different audiences, and hopefully from that we were able to get more responses. And then back in September as well, after we had gathered all the data, analysed it, drafted a report, we invited Christina McKelvey, who's the MSP for older people and the Equalities Minister. So that was quite insightful to kind of be able to kind of draw from our data and kind of ask her what she was maybe doing to kind of attract more BAME people into the workforce, etc. But all that's listed in our report, which is, I believe, is on the chat. But that's all from me. I'm going to now pass on to Lauren, who's going to speak a bit more about our findings.
Thank you, Nikki. So as Nikki told us, we went through education and employment. So I'm going to walk you through kind of 3 surprising, interesting themes that we discovered in those sectors. So firstly, education. And under this, we had an issue of, societal influences, because this impacts the advice that career advisors or guidance counselors give to their students at schools. And 2 issues we discovered were, firstly, loads of BAME women were unaware that they had access to the service, especially BAME women above 25 years old. So that does show a positive shift towards younger women being more likely to use the service and be aware of it, but that doesn't speak to it being any more effective. And secondly, we had something called a one-size-fits-all paradox, where careers advisors are giving the same advice to all of their students, which generally speaking isn't an effective strategy, because each student is different and would have different strengths and plans. And the second tier issue, BAME students and women and the intersection of those 2 identities have a whole range of barriers and concerns that need to be considered and proactively dealt with. Another thing is that there are no or very few BAME careers advisors that are working in Scottish schools right now. Next, we have personal influences, and this had a role model gap, where young BAME women in schools didn't know BAME women in law, law, finance, and all these industries, so didn't understand that they could aspire to those positions. And this, I believe, transfers across to the employment side, because if you're a young BAME woman entry level and you don't see anyone above you, you can't exactly perceive yourself to be the person to rise to the top of the company. Next, we have family aspiration issues with BAME students possibly coming from being first, second, third generation immigrants and having pressure from their family members to pursue certain paths which might not necessarily be in line with their interests or talents. Finally, the next major thing we found was systemic barriers. And these are things like unconscious bias, poor representation, so having a school where there are no BAME teachers or kind of higher officials. And then just a lack of knowledge and resources created for women, firstly, and then for BAME women to kind of help them and support them as they work through this journey and make educational plans to pursue degrees and then jump into possibly apprenticeships or internships and finally full-time employment. Moving on to the employment side, we discovered an intention action gap, where many employers said that they have inclusion and diversity policies. Quite a few said that they had someone responsible for inclusion and diversity, maybe like one officer whose entire job was that role. But that positive intention doesn't transfer to the lived experiences of BAME women in the workplace. It seems like policies are being written and they're not necessarily transferring to proactive choices that support BAME women in interviews, in meetings, and all manner of just kind of interpersonal work situations. Next, we had the issue of workplace harassment and low cultural literacy or empathy. What is happening is BAME women are being identified quite quickly and easily, possibly, by virtue of who they are, and they are being teased or bullied or even not considered for higher jobs based on our survey responses. From what they perceive, it's based on their race and cultural identity. An example is a BAME woman fasting during the month of Ramadan and needing to or wanting to pray or speak about this very important time in her life, and having coworkers kind of laugh about it, push it off, or ask incredibly insensitive questions. So that is a massive gap that can be supported by employers having racial sensitivity training, or just creating the kind of environment that doesn't allow for that kind of harassment in general, and then doesn't allow for racially charged or a racially based harassment in specific. Next, we discovered from our surveys of BAME women in the workplace that private sector employers were less likely to offer support for BAME women specifically, or use targeted recruitment, which kind of focused on them and went into spaces where you're more likely to get responses from the BAME community. And this is also another point that links to the education sector, where there is not as much access to careers, events, fairs, resources, materials for BAME young people. And that is an important recommendation that we'd like to make to you and employers across different industries, going into BAME places of worship, maybe making connections within BAME networks and using them as a conduit to share information about your goods, services, and recruitment activities so that you can get responses from the BAME community. Because having a policy to recruit more BAME individuals, but then not making the conscious effort to get the information into the spaces where they are, leads to the same intention action gap that I mentioned to begin with. So that is kind of a few key findings that we discovered through, like what Nikki said, the surveys, the meetings. And if you want to read more about all kinds of other findings, please follow the link to the report that I think is somewhere in the chat, and give it a good read.
Thank you so much, Lauren, Rabia, and Nikki. You did a brilliant job this morning, not only talking about the importance of the research, describing the process, and also the findings. So thank you three so much. It goes without saying why this is such an important topic. I think as a young woman myself in senior management in my industry, there are only 3% of us across senior management positions in the creative industries across the UK. So I think a lot of the findings that you discussed and a lot of kind of the lived experiences of BAME women across different industries, it really resonates with me in particular. and I know it's all of us, it's for all of us in the sector, and making sure that there's inclusion across all sectors. So with that in mind, because I'm curious, I'm sure the three of you went into this with your own lived experiences, your own maybe kind of hints at what might be at play. So I'm really curious, kind of moving us into our panel, and please, audience, feel free to drop questions in the chat. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. My first question to the three of you is, was there anything from the research and findings that surprised you that you didn't expect? Or on the flip side of that, that confirmed what you already thought? So what was it about kind of the process and research and findings that you were surprised by or didn't expect? I'm going to start with you, Rabia.
I think a lot was sort of expected. I think I'm thinking about my sort of own personal experiences, and then when we saw a lot of sort of women agree, I think it's sad and it's upsetting, but it's also I think a lot of us just need that platform to raise our voice and say, actually, this is how I'm feeling, and I want someone to listen to me, and I want someone to take this seriously and take this forward and make change. So a lot of that was expected. I remember one stat I thought was quite surprising, when 21% of employees came forward and said that, you know, their organization had sort of no diversity inclusion policies in place. I thought that was really surprising. I think in this day and age, diversity inclusion is something, it's so important. It's not something, you know, I just feel like it's something that every organization should have in place. And it's not just about having that in place for the BAME people in the organization, it's also for people who aren't from a BAME background, because it's so important to be able to sort of learn about each other and learn about sort of our differences. Like, I think the best way you can work in a workplace is when you appreciate everyone's differences around you, and you learn about it, and you're given the opportunity through sort of a diversity and inclusion sort of team in the workplace, you can sort of really enforce that. So yeah, I think that was a stat I remember being that I thought was quite surprising.
I completely understand why you would have been surprised by that. And I think what you said about why it's so important in this day and age is true. And, you know, we have the Equality Act. There's so many other conversations happening around inclusion, equity, diversity. So I think that's a really great thing to highlight. Thank you, Rabia. Nikki, yes, what surprised you about the findings, or indeed confirmed what you already thought?
I think for me, I remember one of the stats, it was saying that the respondents basically said that there were no BAME women in leadership roles. So like 80.4% of respondents said that there weren't any. And I think that just kind of confirms like that there is such a lack of BAME women in those leadership positions, but it's also like hard at the same time, because, well, if you're not recruiting BAME women in the first place, then how are they going to get to these leadership roles? So there's definitely like a gap in the sector, I guess, and how to kind of maybe recruit people, retain them as well. So I remember like reading through one of the responses, actually, like there was a woman that actually had to remove herself from the organization, like to find work somewhere else, because I think it was something to do with like racial harassment she experienced. But I'm just like, wow, like someone actually has to seek another job because they find that their employer is not supportive of them at all. And it shouldn't be like that, because you might be losing a really valuable employee, and she could have had like so much to contribute, but it's a shame like that she had to like look for another job because of that. So I think there's definitely room for improvement in terms of how employers kind of go about like diversifying like the sector, but also just having to look at your like racial harassment policies, and what maybe support systems are in place to kind of support your employees if they are kind of experiencing that. And it's also hard as well when, if you're like the only BAME person in that organization, and if you've experienced something or you've experienced like racial abuse, etc., then you're going to find it difficult to report that as well, because if you report that, then people are going to automatically know, even though it will be anonymous, like people will automatically know it's you because you're the only BAME person in that organisation. So it's just trying, again, figure out ways to kind of mitigate that. But I think it's really important as well to kind of actually involve BAME people within the development of these like policies as well, because they are the ones with the lived experience. And that goes with not just like BAME people, but with other people with like protected characteristics as well. So it's really important to kind of involve them. So yeah.
Definitely, Nikki. And again, that resonates with my own experience. I've experienced racial discrimination and workplace harassment. I've reported it. And because no one within the organization understood what that looks like and understood what that harassment was, it wasn't well handled. And I think that it's a massive problem across a lot of sectors and industries that talent is being lost. People are moving on, and the kind of understanding of what that looks like isn't universal, because it also is very challenging for people to accept what that harassment and abuse actually means. So I think that point that you've raised is so important, and collectively looking at ways that we can mitigate that, and as you said, making sure those policies are co-created with people from that protected characteristic and group is so fundamental. So thank you so much for highlighting that, Nikki. Lauren, on to you. What did you find that you either thought was surprising, unexpected, or confirmed what you thought?
I think I agree with Nikki and Rabia in that many things were just confirmations from our own experiences, trying to get jobs, just kind of occupying these spaces. Personally, I'm an international student, so I've only been here for 3 years and a bit studying at the university. So I'm used to having employers show up and give out smoothies and want to talk to students from the University of Edinburgh about jobs in these industries, and talk about, to me specifically, because I look how I look, about their great diversity programs and what have you. And reading all of the survey responses and hearing that all of that is possibly a marketing ploy was really scary and disappointing as someone who will be graduating and entering employment. And also I'm realizing that I go to a good university, so I occupy a space of privilege where people are seeking out students in this space for jobs. And that's not true for a majority of institutions or schools. And thinking about the reality that possibly if you come from a BAME background, you might also come from a poor background. And so you might not go to the best schools. And you are being potentially actively ignored by people who can offer you internships, apprenticeships, employment in the long run, because they're not coming to your school and wanting to present at your career fairs. And just creating this attainment gap from what I'm perceiving for absolutely no reason, because these are people with talent and potential who'd make wonderful recruits one day.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Lauren, for also highlighting that. I think you're right. My second question, and again, encouraging the rest of the people joining us on our Zoom chats and call, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. We're open to them. My second question to the panel is, what was challenging about conducting the research? And I'm going to start with you, Lauren. We'll go back the other way. So what was challenging about conducting the research?
I think it was the surprise logistics change that was coronavirus. We had all kinds of plans that were just based in kind of the pre-COVID world that would have possibly given us more access to certain groups of people, that would have allowed us to better engage with stakeholders and ask maybe more questions in focus groups and what have you, and that just couldn't transfer online in some ways. But in many ways, it allowed us to like be creative and work with a totally different kind of thought process.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lauren. Nikki, what did you find challenging?
I think for me, it's probably just like frustrating to see so many people experiencing the same level of like discrimination and abuse that I have experienced as well, and how little change there is. Again, like just what Rabia and Lauren were saying before, it's just you've experienced it yourself, and now you're seeing like so many other people experiencing the same thing, and that's only like a snapshot of of that. Like there's going to be so many more people who will eventually go into employment and work elsewhere and they'll have the same thing, but yet nothing's being changed. But I do really hope, like genuinely, that throughout even just like the whole pandemic, about how ethnic minorities are kind of vulnerable to different areas of like inequality. So yeah, that's what I find challenging.
Thank you, Nikki. I definitely hear that. Rabia, what about you?
I think I definitely agree with both Lauren and Nikki. I mean, definitely the pandemic made it sort of challenging in terms of sort of collecting and sort of doing research and conducting focus groups and sort of collecting research. And then, like Nikki said, yes, it's weird when you have your own experiences, and then like it really does bring it to life when you hear everybody else around you saying the same thing, and actually, I'm feeling this too, or I've gone through this too, and you're like, wow, this is an issue. This is quite a big issue. I think something that can also be a bit challenging as well is I've always been a bit quiet about like Young Women Lead has definitely given me the opportunity to raise my voice. It's given me the platform to speak about these issues, but before that I sort of might have just been a bit quiet about this and not really raised my voice and said as much about these topics, and I think the challenge that we sometimes face is still a lot of being women who go through these issues might not openly want to come forward about this and speak about it, and I completely understand that is challenging to speak about, but not like until we know, we won't be able to then make those changes and make those differences. So I think that can, and sometimes in itself, be a challenge. And it definitely was when we were trying to collect sort of feedback and get people to fill out our surveys.
Definitely, and we thank you for raising your voice around this, because without the three of you and the rest of the Young Women Lead cohort, this research wouldn't be here. So thank you for that. We have some questions that are coming through in the chat, so I'll ask my third and last question to you panelists, and then we'll hop on to the rest of the Q&A. My last question for you from me is, what is your top recommendation to employers after conducting this research to start to address this issue in the workplace? I'll start with you, Rabia.
So I think there's a lot more focus in terms of sort of recruitment and bringing BAME people into your organization, and employers looking at how how we can sort of change our recruitment policies so that more people are attracted to certain roles. But I think sometimes what we forget about is we bring these BAME people into the organizations, and we think this is great, they've got this job, they're in the industry now, but that is just very much the start, and I think so much more then happens then. It's like once you're in this industry, there's so many other barriers, or there's so many other concerns, or like how do you develop and what's best, and looking for that support in your workplace. So I think retention needs to be a bigger focus as well, and what we're doing to support the BAME people in our industry, or in your workplace. And I think another thing, so along with that, I think what employers really need to be doing is sort of looking at the policies they've got in place, and seeing what's working and what's not, whether that's done yearly or every couple of months. It's one place to put policies in place, but is it working? Do we know it's working, or have we just got them there? And you can do this through sort of like focus groups, or just really speaking to the people in your workplace and asking them straight out, do you think this is of any benefit to you? And then if it's not, then maybe we make changes to these policies in place. So I think so I think my one would be sort of tracking progress, and sort of checking and challenging on the policies we've got in place, and seeing how we can learn from each other best and maybe make changes to it if it's not going to plan.
Great recommendation, Rabia. Thank you. Nikki, what's your recommendation to employers? Your top recommendation?
I think probably gathering appropriate data. So what I mean by that is like you'll have known that employers have to like submit gender pay gap stats and data, and that's fine, but you have to look closer into like different ethnic minorities and how the pay gap is quite wide between different ethnic groups, because it's fine if it's gender and you'll get that men and women pay gap, but there's just so much more than just the gender lens. So we really definitely have to look and consider how gender and like your ethnic background affects how you're paid, because then we can achieve we can close the pay gap, you know, and not widen it. So I think that's the top recommendation for me.
That's a great one, Nikki. And before, excuse me, before I move on to Lauren, I think you're getting at something really fundamental to the work we do at YWCA Scotland, the Young Women's Movement. And you were getting at kind of the intersectionality of this issue. And I know that intersectionality is such a buzzword. And it's a question I wanted to ask about, but I'll wait until the end because we have some questions from our audience. But that point that you made, that it isn't just BAME women, it's BAME women that might be disabled, it's BAME women that have different kind of faith groups. And it's just remembering, as you know, but just to say this to our audience, that, you know, the research we're doing is looking at all the protected characteristics and how all those characteristics interact and overlap. See, I'm even inventing new words. So I think that's so important that you started to highlight that, and we'll get back to that as well. So thank you so much for that, Nikki. Lauren, what about you? Your top recommendation?
My top recommendation, I guess, is a continuation and combination of what Rabia and Nikki have just said. What are your diversity and inclusion policies, and do you have metrics that measure that, so that it's not just we feel like we're achieving kind of the mandates we set at the beginning of the fiscal year, but what does it mean on a monthly basis? What does it look like in practice? How is this practical? And by collecting feedback, how useful has it been, so that we know whether we're moving in a positive direction, stagnating, or doing worse than we were before?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lauren. So to summarize, you know, what metrics are in place, what data are organizations collecting, how are those policies being reviewed and tracked? I think those are 3 great recommendations. So to shift on to our questions from our attendees, we have a question that asks, someone's wondering if there are any positive examples or ways of working that you 3 or kind of the panel of researchers found during your research that we can learn from as employers. So I'll give you 3 a moment to think about that. While you're thinking about the positive examples or ways of working, the second question is about, is there any way that we can envision a more unified process of learning and putting diversity and inclusion policies in place across Scotland? So don't worry about the second question. We'll go back to the first one. Positive examples and ways of working that we can learn from that you found during the research. So Rabia, if that's okay, if we start with you.
Sure. So positive examples. I think there's a couple that we came across sort of from employers, some things that employers were doing that seem to work well. And I know we've taken on a few in my office as well, and it's working. So one of them is reverse mentoring. Reverse mentoring is something that we're just kicking off in my office as well. And this is the idea where, you know, you'll sign up to a mentor and you'll get that support throughout your journey, but someone senior in the organization will be able to learn a lot more. You'll be able to mentor them sort of about your background and maybe sort of the barriers you faced and why you faced this. And I think it's so important for senior members in organizations to have this understanding. And I think that's so important and so crucial. So I think reverse mentoring is definitely something that's positive and should really, you know, be adapted a lot more. And something other positive, I think another one is, I know Nikki touched on data, and sort of, you know, companies sharing their data, but I think one thing we also really need to do is we need to understand the makeup of our organizations to then be able to help the staff in the organization. So something companies need to really be doing as well is collecting data and knowing, what is the makeup of their organization or the makeup of the office, and learning a lot more about people's backgrounds. And then being able to work with that data in a positive way. I don't know if that answers your question,
That does.
but
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Rabia. Nikki, yes, what are some positive examples or ways of working you found in the workplace that you'd like to share?
I remember that there was a few employers that kind of did blind recruitment. And for me, I genuinely thought that all employers did that anyway, but I was like, when I saw that, I was like, oh, is that not something that's done anyway? But I think that's like a really powerful way to kind of recruit people, because then you're not like it's that like unconscious bias, I guess, of not being influenced by someone's name or or their background, I guess. But you're basically focusing on their skills, which it should be anyway, but I know that a lot of times like people might be swayed just by looking at someone's name, which is a shame really, because you are losing valuable talent. Even if you feel like you're not looking at their name, like you might still be swayed. So yeah.
Nikki, if I may, just to expand on that a little bit, what would good practice and well kind of organized excuse me, I'm losing my voice from all this talking, what would good practice and well organized blind recruitment look like to you? I mean, you don't have to give us loads of detail, but yeah, what do you think that looks like from a kind of best practice standpoint? Or just even explaining what blind recruitment is, because I mean, I can assume that everyone knows, but yeah, can you just tell us a bit more?
Yeah, I think one of the people or one of the organizations basically just like removed people's names and maybe gave them like a code, like a unique code, so they were able to kind of match up with and then if they chose if they kind of got shortlisted, then they were able to kind of match up with that person. And then I feel like there was one where they kind of took away like the gender of the person as well, because that sometimes again might influence someone's choice of like employee, and also like age as well, and like disability as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much for giving us those examples, Nikki. Lauren, what about you? Examples of positive examples and good practice?
An interesting thing that I got to experience during an internship was they had a monthly pulse check, and it was just not that long survey that checked in on everyone and asked these questions because they wanted to be really proactive about finding out how everyone was finding the working environment. So that seems like a relatively low effort way to really just reach into your workforce and find out how they're coping and how that's going. And another interesting thing is being very supportive of your diversity networks. I think a lot of companies, I don't think, not that many companies have diversity networks for BME people. And when they do get that, I think there's an element of, we have one, so we've solved the problem. When really it's, you need to, maybe it's funding them, maybe it's acknowledging kind of things that they discuss when they bring them to you as management, and having like a moment in a meeting's agenda where you say, this is something that we've received from our diversity network, and how can we do better based on this feedback, so to speak. And it's similar to like empowering a diversity and inclusion lead. Having a person with that title means nothing if your employees don't feel the impact of it. So really thinking about, okay, we've written out a policy, we've recruited or empowered an individual with this role, we've allowed our employees to form this network. How can we support those practices?
Definitely. I think all the points you raised about how to better support the practices, not just allowing networks to exist, for example, are really, really useful and really beneficial. Thank you so much, Lauren. We're going into our last 10 minutes. So we have one more question from the audience, and anyone else that's joining us this morning, please feel free to add. We can probably take one more after this. So that second question was, is there a way you envision a more unified process of learning and putting diversity and inclusion policies in place across Scotland? So yeah, I mean, whoever wants to take this, maybe we can start with Rabia. Yeah, do you see a way that there could be a unified process of putting policies in place? Or what are your thoughts on it?
It's a tough question. I think I think one thing is I think people should definitely share more about what's working for them and what's not. I think we can all definitely learn from each other a lot more, and then sort of know what policies are successful, what aren't, and then build them in. So I think there is a lot of room there for everyone to sort of learn from each other. I know there'll be different employers doing different things, but it's just a matter of sort of, I think, learning from each other and what the different industries are doing, and coming together and saying, this is what we're doing, this works well for us, and learn from it. I think that's something that can be done.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Rabia. Nikki, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think maybe having like a diversity and inclusion like toolkit, I guess, maybe that people can refer to. I mean, it could be developed by like the Scottish Government, or even just like an organisation that might feel like they have good practices and policies in place, like to kind of promote that a bit more, I guess. And just like linking back to like this year as well, like you've seen the resurgence of like the Black Lives Matter movement, and how that's kind of there's been like more talks about why diversity inclusion is so important, like across the workplace, etc. So I think having or being able to kind of refer back to like a toolkit, a diversity and inclusion kind of toolkit, is able to kind of refer back to that and just be able to see what's working and what's not, as Rabia said, and also just maybe having like a network of people from different organizations, then like different sectors as well, like private, public, and third sector. Like we can all learn from each other. Like diversity and inclusion isn't specific to like a specific to a particular sector. It's something that we all should be involved in, even those without lived experience, so I think for me, that's probably the key point.
100%. Thank you, Nikki. I like your diversity and inclusion toolkit, and we have a bit more about that to come on to just after this. So thank you so much for that. Lauren, what about you? What do you think about sort of unified approach?
I think there's a lot to be said for each individual company having a good approach that works for themselves and their workforce. And Nikki is right. If the Scottish Government is that centralizing influencer that does create this toolkit, or there becomes some other, centralizing person who says, I have the experience and the expertise, and this is what I've created that can be useful for you. But I also would like to speak to, I think, each individual company, their management, their employees, proactively working with organizations that could help them develop this toolkit, or within the organization, using kind of the talents and people they have to say, what do we need to change about the policies as they stand? What do we need to change about the experience as it currently is, to make that a lot better? Because I think Nikki just spoke about Black Lives Matter, and like one of the really important things that came out of that is that it's and specifically regarding Black Lives Matter, not necessarily this report, but just to say that there are all kinds of books and resources and podcasts that exist. So educate yourself. And that is true about intersectional experiences. All of these resources are already out there. You can go and find them and use that to adapt the policies in place in your companies to make them more inclusive.
Great, 100%. Thank you, Lauren. And we're going to be bringing this morning to a close. But on that note, YWCA Scotland, the Young Women's Movement, has been working for the last 2 years to specifically look at how we can better support companies, organizations, individual businesses to retain their young women and their talents from diverse backgrounds and intersectional backgrounds, and using an intersectional approach. So this is to say that we're looking to work with companies and organizations in the new year to launch and pilot a program we're developing, which is a consulting kind of relationship. We'll be working with companies and organizations to help them look at their talents, look at how they're retaining young women within their organizations, and to provide a toolkit, training, and support to work with the young women within your companies and organizations to help you kind of address your policies around diversity and inclusion, but help retain that talent. So if it's something that you're interested in, you can get in touch with us at hello@ywcascotland.org. More importantly, all the work that we do is led by young women, co-created with young women, and driven by young women that want to lead. And you've heard from 3 of them today. So if you have any more questions about the work that they've done and the rest of the Young Women Lead panel has done, you can email us at hello@ywcascotland.org. And that's to say that we're looking forward to working with you in the future. There was a question about ways that you can support us as an organisation. We do a lot of work across Scotland, particularly in our Glasgow centre, working with women from marginalised backgrounds. We even have a Christmas card sale on Etsy that's going on at the moment that you can purchase some Christmas cards. But more importantly, we're just really interested in hearing about your experiences and how we can support you in your workplace. So if you're interested in our consulting work, if you're interested in learning more from the young women involved, do get in touch with us. And this is last but not least to say thank you so much to our panelists for all of your work, for sharing your lived experience, for leading this research, for taking it to Scottish Parliament and working with them directly, and for all of your insights this morning. We're eternally grateful, and we're looking forward to doing more work together as an organisation with partners and with you to address this even more directly. So thank you so much to Lauren, to Nikki, and to Rabia. And thanks to everyone that joined us this morning. So we will say goodbye, but hopefully we'll be hearing from you soon. So thanks so much.